Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the podcast festival Listen Up, organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria. For a second year in a row, we are bringing podcast creators and hosts, as well as producers from around the world and from Bulgaria, to showcase some very interesting and inspiring audio stories and program. This festival is made possible with the kind support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, just a few housekeeping tips. For those of you joining us on Zoom, use the Q&A section if you want to ask Isabel some questions. She'll have a chance to answer them towards the end of our conversation. If you're watching us, if you're watching the live stream, you can use the comment section again to ask your questions. And without further ado, I want to say a warm welcome to Isabel Cadenas Cañón. She is an audio producer and a writer based in Spain. She has extensive experience in audio storytelling, and she has worked for a number of radio programs and stations around the world. And tonight we're gonna talk more about one of her latest projects, which is a podcast called We Don't Talk About That. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. And hopefully you'll have a chance to do it if you haven't after our conversation. Recently, she has been appointed as the head of audio at País, one of the most prestigious dailies in Spain. And they're starting their own department of podcasts. So maybe we'll talk about this as well. So Isabel, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mariana. Thanks to the Association of European Journalists, and thanks to you for the invitation and for the talk.
Well, I want to start with a little preview, or for those of you in the audience who haven't listened to We Don't Talk About This. Basically, it's a podcast inspired by silence. Yes, you heard right. It's an audio narrative program, but the inspiration behind it is a phrase actually that was coined during the regime of Franco in Spain, where one of innocent people were killed, and it's known as the White Terror. So Isabel and her colleagues basically introduced to us a range of characters, from people who lost their loved ones during the regime, to doctors who were taking care of patients during the pandemic. And it's a very personal account of those silences that each of the characters want to break. So my first question is actually, as an audio producer, I mean, what does silence feel like for you?
Thanks for the introduction, and also thanks for talking about the podcast. It's actually very funny because I am not a very silent person. So, but at the same time, I've always been working on memory and on the aftermath of the dictatorship here in Spain. And I've always been haunted by how, maybe because I talk a lot and because I like talking and listening, by how little we talk about things that matter. And while I was doing research, I realized that there's this collective trauma. In Spain, there's still 114,000 people that are disappeared, that are still underground, and we don't talk much about that. So also many topics have been left underground, I feel. And you've talked about white terror, um, and I think it's important to say how, in the Spanish Civil War there were two factions. One were like the Democrats, who were they're called Republicans actually because they defended a republic, and then there were the Francoists or the fascists actually, and which were the anti-democrats, and they won the war. And during 4 years, people who were on the other side, on the other faction, learned that keeping silent was probably the only way to be alive, because it was very dangerous to talk about anything, but mostly about politics and religion, if you were not fascist or if you were not Catholic. So people learned to keep silent. And I was born in democracy, but I received this sentence from my father and from my family, like, don't talk about that, don't get into politics, don't let people know what you think. And it's funny that we think we're a very democratic society, but still there's so many silences that still, are alive in our society. So silence is like politically very, very important for me. And also as a sound producer, as an audio producer, I thought it was like a great opportunity to mix both, something like very political and also something very more abstract and more yeah, I would say more conceptual. So working with silences is for me very important in both like form and content.
Yeah, initially it might sound a bit counterintuitive, to have to tell a story about different types of silences in a podcast, but actually I think it become like a very powerful vehicle, to convey emotion and to kind of dip into the history and the memory, as you said. And actually, as somebody who also grew up in a post-communist country, I think a lot of Bulgarians can relate to that phrase as well. We don't talk about this because we still haven't reconciled with our own, traumatic past of sorts. And also, when you talk about the podcast, you also talk about a very personal story that was a personal exploration for you. You lost your mother as a child, so was it hard to explore this narrative as well, even though you're not one of the characters in the story, but you're the narrator?
Um, I think a friend of mine who's a photographer from Argentina, he always says that every artist or every like culture creator is pierced by one thing, and like you can be writing or making stories about many things, but at the end you're always talking about just one thing. And in my case, it's absence, and it's the absence of my mother, and it's like being, left without a mother at a very young age and living with that absence and memory. So I've always been working on these topics. And when I decided to do this on Se Habla, this podcast, I really thought I was doing a podcast about something else. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm doing the same thing again, right? Like I'm writing again and I'm doing audio again about the same thing, which is absence. So it kind of made sense. And I'm fine with it. I think it's totally legit, right? That we are working with the same idea and then, working it on different ways, on different formats. I think it's just like natural, and many of us do the same thing. But it was hard. It was actually hard to the point that I wanted to make my mother's story and do an episode on my mom, and I wasn't able to. So yeah, it was hard. Um, and I realized I've always been very empathetic with the people who dare to talk in my podcast, and I've always been very grateful and quite aware of the step they were giving. Like, this is a very important thing they're doing. They're deciding to talk about things they don't talk about normally. They're deciding to confront their traumas. But when I had to confront my own, and I realized I couldn't make it, was like, wow, it was even like more important for me to realize the work the other people had done. So many times I've been asked, like, how do I find people who want to talk about their silences? And my answer is always that I never forced anybody to talk about their silences, and that everyone who's on the podcast already wanted to break their silences, and that's why they're in my podcast. It's not that I'm, forcing anyone to, you know, talk about something they've never talked about on tape. It's because they really wanted to, or my invitation to talk on the podcast really um, awoke something on them or something like that. Yeah.
And actually, speaking about the characters in the podcast, I just want to follow up on what you just said. So I guess it wasn't that hard to convince the people they were ready to open up and face their traumas or memories or the things that scared them, not to talk about them. But at the same time, how did you choose those characters? How did you choose those exact stories to tell? And again, a couple of the episodes are related to the pandemic and the work of the doctors and kind of the silences around town during lockdown, etc. But some of them go way back, as your friend Emilio. I wouldn't say the last name so I don't mispronounce them, but basically he was one of the first people in Spain in the early 2000s when he basically went on this quest to get the body of his grandfather exhumed, and then basically it became like a whole movement and many people followed in his footsteps and start looking for their own relatives who were victims of Franco's regime. And then you also discover this episode of the history of your town that you weren't aware of. So long story short, how did you choose those exact stories?
I think it's a mixture of really knowing your concept. I think that really helps. I am a very, how would I say it? I'm not a very focused person. So I'm interested by every story in the world, but having a very narrow focus really helps or in my case, it really helps because there's a lot of stories that I would like to take to tell, but they don't talk about silences. It's like, okay, so this is a story I won't tell now, or I won't tell in this podcast. So first, there's like stories that are stories of silences, very broadly understood. So that's the first part, and then I think it's a mixture of. I think every editorial process is a mixture of what you find, like what you can get and what you would like to get, something like that, right? So some stories, like Emilio's stories, for instance. Emilio is one of my best friends, and I've always told him like I wanted to write his profile. And then when I did the program of the first season, Emilio's story wasn't there. But then when I was like working on the production of the other stories, I was like, Emilio's story has to be part of this series and has to be the last story because it's a story that gives sense to everything else. So it's a mix of what you can get, what you want to get, and a mix of intuition. Like, the story is like the puzzle works good together. Maybe there's no like a rational reason for this, and I cannot probably explain it with words, but yeah, it just makes sense. It's like when you have like a newspaper, it makes sense that some stories will go with those stories, or when you read the New Yorker and stories just go well together, right? There's like they all talk about different things, but sometimes there's a topic, and I think that's the idea. There's also stories that I wanted to tell and that I couldn't tell because there was no one alive to tell them, or because they were too complicated. We were working on a story between Spain and Colombia, and the pandemic broke, so we had to kill the story. But yeah, I think it's a mixture of those three things.
And you already mentioned some of the big themes that you were addressing, not just in your podcast, but also as a audio storyteller in general. So it's the silence, the memory, the trauma, the absence. But what were the specific questions that have been haunting you during the production of this series?
I've never thought about this, Mariana. So I have to think about this a little bit, but I think there's been a change in me throughout the production of the podcast. This is a very generational podcast. I think it's me talking to my parents' generation, clearly, right? So, and actually, most of the people who talk on the podcast are between 50 and 60, who are the age of our parents, let's say, or a little older, but they're that generation. And those are the generation that in Spain did what we call la transición. So it's the transition to democracy. Franco died in 1975, and then there was like a probably 5, 7, 10 year period where la transición took place. So this transition to democracy has been told and has been transmitted to us as something like perfect, like it was perfect. Spain decided to forget its past and just look forward. And in that very generous gesture, we we got to live together. So there's some words like cohesion or forgiveness or yeah, cohabitation that are like very common in Spain. Uh, but my generation, and actually thanks to people like Emilio, has realized that that wasn't really the case because there's still so many things we can talk about because there's still like 114,000 people underground in mass graves that we haven't unearthed because there's still people looking for justice that haven't gotten justice because there's still so many things going on in our country that weren't addressed during the transition because it was a very the transition was based on a pact of silence. That's what we call it. So there. So I think a lot of people from my generation are questioning that generation. So the podcast started like that, and it wasn't something. I didn't start it as something. I didn't say like I'm going to talk to people from my father's generation. No, but then I realized like, oh my god, I'm talking about the same thing all the time. I'm being too loud. People are listening to me because I'm being too loud. and but little by little, I started to realize something that is very weird, and it's that I realized that this is something I would never admit to have said, but I'm gonna say it. Um, I realized that it's hard to tell your kids about some things, and I realized that still, I think that process was not a perfect process, and I think it's a process that brought a lot of problems to Spain politically. The elites are still the same elites as were during the Francoist period, But I also think that, for instance, in families, parents want to protect their kids, and that's why they don't talk about things that are hard to tell. And I'm not saying that I agree. I actually don't have kids, so I don't know how I would do this if I was a mother. But I can say that I understand something that I didn't understand before. Before I was like, no, you have to tell everything, and you have to. And throughout the process of this podcast, I realized that people don't always want to know, and that people don't always want to tell the things that are hurtful. Yeah, and I'm not saying that it's fine, but I can say that I have changed in that sense. I don't know if I answered your question, Boriano.
It's okay. It was very interesting to hear, because this kind of storytelling provides a bridge in a way between two different generations and like the opportunity to share stories. And this kind of ties up to my next question, actually, which is why did you choose this format? So basically, We Don't Talk About This is a narrative nonfiction podcast. Why did you think this is the best way to tell those stories?
I think it's how I've always worked. I've always been working on long form. When I was writing, I was also writing long form, and in audio, I was also always doing like documentaries. So it's what I was naturally drawn to do. There was I didn't even think about it. Like there was no way this was going to be like an interview podcast. So there was no way this was going to be like a fiction podcast. It's just like my way to interact with society, I guess. I think if I was a filmmaker, I would be making documentaries. And when I'm writing, I'm writing like long form nonfiction. So this is like the format that it's like natural to me. And I also think there's in Spanish there's a lot of room for experimentation with narrative nonfiction. So there's a lot of things and a lot of formats that I could import from English or from French that I was really liking in other languages and that I wasn't listening to in Spanish. So yeah, I also wanted to experiment with formats that were narrative nonfiction.
Thank you. And just to remind our audience, you can ask your questions using the Q&A section of this webinar or in the comment section if you're watching the live stream on Facebook. Yeah, so you talked about the intimacy in a way that narrative audio storytelling allows you to do. But what were the challenges of creating a podcast from scratch, and especially finding those stories, production, etc. As far as I could see, you weren't a very big team,
No.
so I assume it was a lot of work.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. And it's funny because I always wonder what would have happened if the pandemic didn't exist. Because we were due to launch the podcast in June 2020, but then the pandemic broke. And I think it would have been a very different podcast because we had more time to work in stories. We also had less freedom to do anything else. So some of the stories I had already recorded in before the pandemic. Like half of the stories I had already recorded before the pandemic, and half of the stories I recorded during the pandemic. In the summer when we could leave our houses. So it was tough. It was tough because we had to set up a whole system from scratch. We didn't have a system. We didn't have social media. We didn't have a calendar. So yeah, it's always very hard creating something from scratch. And this was also the case. We were a 4-people team. So Laura was in charge of communication. She was also like an editor. Vanessa was our main editor. And then Paula was our associate everything. She was like assisting us with social media, also with production, also with with many things. I think actually this podcast happened thanks to the pandemic. I'm thinking now, because if in other time we wouldn't have so much time to work on the stories, and this is actually a challenge we face now for the second season. Because now, we have work jobs and we're working on other things, and it's the good part is the whole infrastructure is created, so we don't have to create anything from scratch. But finding the stories, producing the stories, editing the stories, and it's the same process. And in my case, it takes a lot of time. The good part of being an independent podcast is that you really don't have anybody telling you, setting deadlines for you, which is bad also on one side because you can go on forever. That is also, some of the stories I made wouldn't have been possible with working in any other form, because I don't know, the story about my town where I discovered this story that I didn't know, it took a year to produce, and it takes a year, so you have to wait because the story won't be ready if you want to launch it in 6 months.
And I have a follow-up question on that, because yesterday with us was actually Asta Chaturvedi, who is a producer on The Daily. And of course, the New York Times is an institution, and they can afford to hire dozens of producers. They have several editors, fact checkers, all the help they can get. So it's a very different production process and scripting, etc. But you're a small team, and as you mentioned, you're an independent podcaster. So how is it different? Not just building together or building the narrative and the stories, but also finding the money, promoting the podcast, finding your audience, etc. I mean, just to tell our audience, this podcast has already won several awards. So yeah, maybe take us a little bit behind the scenes of what were the struggles maybe that you encountered on the way.
Yeah, we were very lucky because we had a fellowship from a grant from Google Podcasts. We were part of Google Podcast Bureau program, which was held by PRX in Boston. So I wouldn't say, I mean, we are an independent podcast, but we're a very lucky independent podcast because we had a lot of resources, and more than economical resources, we had a lot of a big network of people to work with and to learn from. So, and they were setting deadlines for us for the pilot, for the first 2 pilots. So that was very helpful. If it was for me, I would be working on the same story forever, and I would never release anything. So that was very helpful. As far as finding your audience, for us, it was a very beautiful process, and I wouldn't change that for anything else. Because it was a very handmade process, and I think people could really feel that. And podcasting is very individual, and it's very like, it's a community, but it's also like very targeted medium. So I think, and this is Laura, the person who was dealing with communication in our podcast, who was really, I think she really created a language that was very similar to the language of the podcast. So we were talking in the same way in the podcast and in our social media. And another thing we did that I think was very successful was we included our audience since the beginning of the editorial process. So before launching the podcast, our audience was part of our podcast. So we did story dinners, and we invited people to my house. I was cooking, and we had like a dozen of people talking about silences and talking about stories.
So it's a podcast and a dinner.
Yes, definitely. We also had editing sessions with the audience. So we had work in progress sessions in which we invited people over, and they listened to our episode, and basically they gave us feedback. And we made the episode better because we realized the flaws of the episode. And those were so important for our podcast, so important. So that was before launching the podcast. We already have, I don't know how many, but maybe like 1,000 people on Instagram and on Twitter, which is not a lot, but it's like we hadn't launched. So we already had like some people who were following the project, and we also like knew me or knew Lara and knew what we were doing before. So we're interested in our like way of thinking or our way of talking already. So that really helped. We also, for instance, we put ads on print newspapers looking for silences. We made a lot of like crazy things, and we made videos. We went on the streets to talk to people about silences. So yeah, it was a very beautiful process, and I think that really was. I think people could see that we were very transparent from the beginning, and we were really we wanted to share the whole process with the audience without being like. It's not that we wanted to show us, we wanted to show our process. And that was, we weren't making like stories about us. We were making stories about our podcast and our in silences. So I think that really, that was something that worked really well. And those were, I think the biggest struggle at the beginning was not being, so this was very beautiful, but also we knew we weren't part of the mainstream discourse. And I don't know if we wanted to be part, but of course, like we weren't on the press, but then our first episode won like a very big award here in Spain. So then right away we started being part of the discussion, the press and everything. So for us, we were very lucky in that sense too. Our first episode right after releasing was very successful and was very listened. So that was a way in which our community felt very happy, but also like we were in more mainstream channels, which is not very common for an independent podcast here in Spain.
That's actually fascinating to know that you kind of use this mixture of digital but also analog ways to advertise and promote and involve the listeners even before the final product was ready. So yeah, I hope I learned something for sure. I hope some Bulgarian podcasts producers and creators could also use those tips, because podcasting is kind of experiencing a boom at the moment in Bulgaria, but of course it's hard everywhere to to be built on a loyal audience. And if you have already 1,000 people following you on social media even before you launch, I think that's a good step in this direction. Well, speaking about your audience. So basically, or at least when I listened to it, I gathered that one of the ideas with the podcast was to start a conversation, about those taboos. And in one interview, you actually mentioned that, silences in Spain are not born out of fear. So what was the impact basically of the podcast? Did you manage to start that healing process or start at least public conversations on some of the issues that we were raising?
I think it's very hard to measure the impact. And I think also our podcast is part of, as I said, of a generational thing of people questioning the way the transition was made and the way our democracy was brought to us. But and I didn't want this podcast to be a healing process. Like I don't feel very comfortable with that. Like I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm a storyteller, and that's something Anna Sales says. And I really like that. Like when she's asked this question, and I was like, yeah, now I understand why I don't feel comfortable with that. So I want people to feel very comfortable when they tell the stories, but I want their stories to be told the best way possible. And that's why I'm there. I'm not there for them to heal, and I'm not there to make like a therapeutic process with them. I think the something that the podcast managed to pass on was the tagline of the podcast is a podcast that links the dots between personal and collective silences. So I do think that's something that stuck with people. The fact that, as you said, like my mom died when I was very young, and we didn't talk about that in my family. And I really always thought that was something that only happened in my family. But then when I was older, I realized that it happened in many other families. And I started to realize that our personal silences were collective, right? Like there's so many personal silences in Spain that they're all linked and they create like a constellation of a social silence. So I think, I don't know if the podcast got to situate this in the public discourse, but I think it was many people were touched by this, and I think it opened the eyes of some people to this idea that their personal silence were impersonal only, right? They were part of like a political system. So I think maybe that was like something that the podcast made in some people, and then we had many people write to us telling us their silences and telling us how they felt identified with the stories. So for instance, the last story we made, which was about the doctors who were working during the pandemic and one of them left. It's one of the most beautiful messages we got is of a girl who was a patient in her hospital. And she said, like, I was always complaining and I was always complaining about the doctors. And then I listened to your podcast and I realized why everything was working so badly. And I felt shameful, like, these people are really having a hard time and I'm complaining. So, opening the eyes to other realities to people, that's something I think also worked. Also with something very funny happened in in the summer 2019. So now when I heard about COVID, um, I decided we were gonna do like a mini series within the podcast that was called Voices from Confinement, Voices from Lockdown. This was summer 2019. So we decided to make story, to go to prison and make story about prison, and also to make story about a woman. We sent a recorder to a woman who's in a refugee camp in Western Sahara, and she recorded herself. So these were voices that we don't normally hear, but that we had access to. And these stories were made by January 2020, and then the lockdown came, and it was like, wow, this is very crazy. And it was very crazy to see how people engaged with the stories in another way, because now we were in lockdown too, and now we were lockdown voices too. So that was also something very magical that happened with our podcast.
Yeah, you already mentioned sending recorders, going to prison, and sharing this actually very intimate portraits. Like the listener really gets an insight into somebody's life. And I wonder, was it hard to convince or to for those people, for your sources, to open up in front of the microphone and the audience in general?
No, no, it wasn't. And actually, all the stories we tell, it's, as I said before, stories of people who wanted to tell their stories. Also, I really love interviewing. I really, it's something that I think it's the thing that I like the most in the world. So for me, it's not as much as about interviewing as it is about having a conversation with someone. So I think people felt safe, honestly, and when we were talking, when they were talking to us, and you can feel that in the podcast, they felt safe. Um, and also they knew I wasn't gonna be like, I wasn't gonna be saying anything about them that they didn't want to, or they weren't gonna say anything on tape that they weren't comfortable with, and I was gonna use afterwards. Um, so no, it wasn't hard to have people open up. I mean, I think it's part of our our work as audio producers to make people feel comfortable when they talk.
And actually, I wonder how you strike the balance, or how did you find that golden middle between, the voices of your characters and you as a narrator, or like the scripted narration used in the podcast?
I think with a lot of editing. So I think that's the way, and also by thinking very well of how I wanted, what was the best way to tell every story. So in De Eso No Se Habla, every story is a different format. And for me, that was very important, that if there was no model, established model, like we didn't have to follow established model. We had to find the way that was the best way to tell every story. So that's why some stories are very highly narrated, I'd say, but some of the stories are non-narrated, like the story of the refugee woman from Western Sahara. Like, I'm only there for the introduction, then I leave, and I really enjoy that, like finding my presence in the story. Some stories are essays, so in the essays, I'm more present, because you're not only listening to a story, but you're also listening to my process making the story. But that's something I also enjoy. So yeah, I think finding the balance is about, yeah, thinking about the story a lot and making a lot of drafts and working working a lot and having very good editors.
Well, actually, speaking about your presence, we have a question. Is the personality of the host or the narrator as important as the story?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the story is the most important part. I think you can have a very charismatic host, but if you don't have a very well crafted story, it will be just like someone talking. And yeah, I don't think so. I think you have to have a good host, and I think that the host's voice has to match the podcast's voice, and I think that's very important. But I don't think the host's personality is more important than the story. No, no.
Well, earlier you said that, you're not a psychologist, you're not there, or the goal of this podcast is not to start the process of healing, etc. You're a journalist. So I wonder, or audio storyteller, I wonder, did you have any other ethical dilemmas during the production or, the scripting of the stories, etc.? Some tough calls that you needed to make?
Some short calls that I needed to make. Yeah, and I think all the dilemmas are also part of the process and are also part of the podcast. So, for instance, in our first episode is the story of a woman whose mother um, had a mental health problem, and she disappeared from her house very often when the main character was like a little girl, and she didn't know why. And then when she was older, she learned that her mother had a double life, let's see, and she had been the lover of a very rich man during the dictatorship, which was totally forbidden. So that created like a mental health problem for her. And for instance, this story, there was another character in the story, and it's that man's son. And I really wanted to have that son in the story. So I wanted to be a two voice story, but that man decided not to talk. So at some point I thought like there's no story because I cannot tell only one part of the story. But then I realized that that silence was also part of the story. So I incorporated that silence to the story, and that's how the story, and I think it made for a richer story. So, for instance, that was one problem, but that wasn't an ethical dilemma actually. Um, Ethical dilemmas. I'm sure there have been many, but now I can think of, yeah, I can think of any precise one. I'll think about it more. But
Sure.
I'm sure there have been many ethical
Or
dilemmas.
maybe there weren't any.
I have ethical dilemmas every day, so I would be very impressed that there wasn't any. Yeah.
Well, one of the questions actually that you raised during the series is, what do we make out of the silences we inherit? And again, this ties up to memories, the history, etc., the taboos. What did you have an idea, or what did you want your listeners to take away from the podcast?
Um, yeah. In every story, there's something I want them to take away for sure. Like I always say, my podcast is a very populistic podcast. Like I want people who don't care about these topics to care. So, for instance, the prison episode, for me, that episode was made for people who have never thought of prisons and who really don't care about prison system. Um, and all, my goal is always to make people who don't care. And I make that through storytelling, because you don't care about prison, but you care about a woman who is now in love, and talks about her boyfriend as a teenager, and then tells you that she has been beaten up by her previous um, husband. So that shock, I think, really makes you like feel empathetic with someone you would have never thought of being empathetic with. So mainly for me, that's the thing. Like there's maybe two main things. One is to feel empathetic with people you would never have thought to feel empathetic with, and another one is to think of how our democracy has been built, and how faulty it is, um, and how we still live in a society that is silent on many important issues that we shouldn't be silent about.
And at the end, I mean, what was your kind of verdict of sorts after you finished the first season? I'm glad to hear that there's a second one coming. Um, well, you talk about empathy and all these emotions. So could silence be a vehicle actually to convey those emotions?
Could silence be a vehicle to convey?
Yeah, those emotions that you described also,
I
empathy or care or
I think silence is very important. I think in many of my interviews, there's long moments of silences in which we're just like thinking. I think I got a sentence. I have a friend sent me the other day like a message saying that two people. It wasn't a romantic thing, but it was like two people who love each other or who really like each other don't need to talk. And I really like that too. It's like, oh, that's true. Like sometimes you don't need to talk. And it's very funny because in Spain we're a very silent society, but we're making noise all the time, and we're a very noisy society, and we're talking all the time. So there's something we're hiding. Like we're not, we cannot be silent. Why, right? Um, yeah. So my answer is maybe. I'm not sure, but maybe.
okay. And we actually have another question. What kind of feedback did you receive from the audience? And you mentioned already that you received many news stories about other types of silences. Do you have a favorite one or memorable one?
Um,
Some or some of them that touched you.
yeah, I think the one with the doctors that I told before really was really touching. And yeah, I think we have had so much feedback. Um, One of the stories we're considering for next season is the story of someone who told us their story on Instagram, like the whole story, like, and I couldn't stop listening to what she was telling me. It's like, oh my God, this is amazing. So it's it's actually at the beginning now we're more used to it, but at the beginning I was like, wow, I never realized I was dealing with such delicate material, and that people were gonna tell me their stories, because we got, and we still get, a lot of very powerful and very hard stories and very tough stories. So yeah, I think I didn't realize at the beginning that this was gonna happen, and it's fine because maybe if I had known this, um, yeah, we would have been like harder to make stories. So I think it was beautiful also that we made the stories without knowing the impacts they were gonna have. Um, and more precise stories. Yeah, we had. It's very funny. For instance, my hometown is a very like ugly place. But now many people have written to us telling me that they have gone to visit my hometown to know about the story we produced. So that's very beautiful. For instance, yeah. Oops, I can't hear you. Are you silent?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, we're talking about silences, and I muted
Let's
myself.
silence.
Yeah. Well, finally, a silence in the conversation as well. Um, can you tell us a little bit about that story? Actually, the plaque that you found that not only you but other people in your town have never
Yeah.
knew about. So just briefly, because I found it fascinating as well.
Yeah. So my town is a normal town next to Bilbao, the capital. I mean, the biggest town in the Basque Country, and it's a working class town. And during the 70s, right after Franco died, 11 people 10 women and 1 man were put in prison because they had done abortions. So they were on trial for more than 10 years, and their trials ended in 1985. And their trials were the opportunity for the feminist movement in Spain to talk about abortion. Right, abortion had been banned during the dictatorship, And then thanks to these women, the feminist movement really like promoted these women and promoted their case in order to foster a public debate about abortion. So they were found guilty at the end. So they didn't go to prison because a lot of time had passed. But this was 1985, and 1 month after they were found guilty, the abortion law, the law that permitted abortion in Spain, was passed. So it's very interesting because thanks to them, we have like an abortion law in Spain today. But the fact is that, and they were very famous, but no one saw their faces. And after that, they never talked again, never. So I started looking for them, and the fact is that I could only find one woman who wanted to talk. And in my town there's a plaque that commemorates this event. And so I got to talk to one of these women. She talked to me, and she didn't know that it was thanks to them that we had abortion in Spain, and she didn't know there was a plague, and she didn't know anything actually. So I actually went with her to see the plague, and it was a very like moving moment. Yeah, and now actually this was a story that had a lot of impact because now many people know about this story, and it's, yeah, I think it's been like our biggest success, this story. We got a lot of prizes for this story, like journalism prizes, and this one was a very long story to produce.
Yeah, isn't it strange, even the hometowns that sometimes we dislike and can't wait to leave, actually have this hidden, secrets and great stories, and now other people are visiting it because of your podcast. Well, actually, towards the end, I kind of want to switch gears a bit and kind of move from this safe space that audio storytelling is creating to your new role, which is at a newspaper and creating an audio department from scratch. So how did you find this change, and what are the challenges now, or could you tell us what is the plan, having a traditional media creating their own audio department?
Yeah, it's a big change. It's a big change. I've always been a freelancer, so now it's like, oh my god, I'm in this very big place with a lot of amazing journalists. So our plan is not very shocking. Like, we're launching, of course, a daily, as everyone is. We're trying to make like a daily that really sounds like a newspaper, but also kind of more fresh and more natural as podcasting is. So, taking the two best things of, El País and of podcasting and putting them together, like very good journalism, but also like fresher voices. So I think that's that's what we're trying to do. And right now, at the beginning, we're really at the beginning. So we're starting to set up the team. Also, audio storytelling is not something that everyone is used to. So it's also beautiful to establish like a language from scratch, right? A language among our team, and a language that we're trying to export also to the newsroom. So it's a very different process to what I've been doing before, and I'm learning a lot. I think that's
Well, good luck to the daily. Hopefully that will be, the Spanish version of the New York Times Daily.
I hope so, but we're not so many people as the daily, but
And speaking about genres and formats, actually, so you're an audio storyteller. Now you are learning how to do news podcasting, and you're also a poet and a writer. So out of all these domains, which is your favorite, and where do you feel more comfortable as a creator?
I've never thought of this, but for me, I always think more about the struggle because I want to make everything all the time. So it's like, maybe I cannot be writing a book right now because I'm making a lot of things. So I have to like stop myself and kind of be on one or two things. Um, so that's hard. But for me, it's not really about the format. It's more about the language. So where I feel the most comfortable is, I think my podcast is a very good example of how when I feel comfortable. I feel very comfortable in first person, um, and I feel very comfortable between essay and documentary, which for me is also poetry. So I also feel, yeah, I think poetry, essay, documentary, that's where I feel the most comfortable. And that can be done in probably any genre. So I would also feel very comfortable if I was doing filmmaking, like essay filmmaking or, um, yeah. So it's not really the format, it's more the language where I feel comfortable. Yeah.
Okay, and well, lastly, if somebody is starting out their own podcast right now, what will be your advice?
Um, I would ask them why they want to start a podcast and not write a book or do a radio program. Like I would really ask them why and what's your reason for that, and also who you want to address. For me, I think we always have to think of who's going to listen to our podcast and really talk to those people. Because if you're not talking to anybody, you can just like do a podcast at your place and just wait for yourself, and that's fine. But if you're putting it out there in the world, it's for someone. So I think you have to find that person. It doesn't have to be like a whole bunch of people. Just for one person is enough. But I think you have to have that person clear. That was something that I learned in Boston with PRX, and for me, it was like game changer. Um, Finding the person you're talking to, and that person will be your referee. That person will be your focus and will help you like make a lot of decisions. So for me, yeah, I think it's fine if when you ask that question, like why do I want to make a podcast? If the answer is no, like, if the answer is because everyone has a podcast, don't make it. Or if the answer is because it's a fad, don't make it. Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of work and a lot of time you have to put into making a podcast if it's a good podcast. So yeah, I think that would be my answer.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel. We're very happy that you found the time to take part in this conversation. And I really regret that we cannot welcome you in person in Sofia, but maybe some other time. Maybe for the second season of
Yes.
We Don't Talk About It. And actually, I could see this as it's a universal topic. There are a lot of silences in Bulgaria or the Balkans or in Europe. So I feel like you'll find a lot of stories outside of Spain as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us again. And for our audience, please join us again tomorrow at 6 p.m. When on Friday, it's actually Bulgarian podcasters taking central stage. And we have a few surprises for you then. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Maria.
Sure.
Sorry.
No,
And
go
also, I
ahead.
wanted to say all our episodes are subtitled into English. So if you go to our YouTube channel or if you go to our website, deesonosehabla.com, or on Apple Podcasts, all our episodes come with subtitled videos in English. So yeah, we're very proud of that.
Yes, thanks for the reminder. I mean, I don't speak Spanish either, so that's the way I listen to them. But yes, we like in the post about this conversation, we also posted the link to the website. So yeah, on the English section, you can find the podcast with English subtitles. So there are a lot of fascinating stories there. So I hope you'll have a listen. And Isabel, thank you very much again.
Thanks so
And
much.
have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
You too. Bye. Bye bye.
Bye.